So we've heard a lot about AI today from several different perspectives, and I'll try to put a slightly different lens on that, different perspective, and hopefully add something to the discussion. As you heard in my introduction, I work somewhat in this field. I try to apply AI techniques as well as physics-based simulations to to solve problems in chemistry. But today I'm going to be trying to address a broader field, looking at the AI applications to science in general, talking about some of the achievements, the opportunities, and the ethical implications of these things, which I think are relevant to all of us as scientists. AI is no longer just playing games. We've heard a few mentions today of AI playing games in 1997, playing chess and beating one of the world's best. In 2016, playing the game of Go, which many people think is a much harder game. They predicted that computers would never be able to beat humans at this game. And the reason I mention this is one of the first times, at least in my adult life, where I remember popular press reporting on AI a lot as a case of a computer beating a human at something. So this was kind of a significant milestone. However, I think at this time, there was no practical implication for people's lives, right? Unless you're a very good Go player, this probably wouldn't have had much of an impact on you. You were still thinking of AI as sort of a long-term thing that maybe eventually it will have an impact in my life. But in the intervening years, AI has become much more mainstream in society. And we've seen some examples from the other talks of AI and large language models, as well as image generation. And I'll just show a couple brief examples of that, not to dwell on it since it's been covered earlier. But say I want to think about the Celtics winning an NBA championship. If there's any basketball fans out there, you know that this might happen in a week or two. And as a Bostonian myself, I hope that it does. But I made this image. You can also generate something like a silly pug on roller skates sticking its tongue out. So you can be very specific. I think it's very impressive that these models can incorporate very specific details like that. And what I want to highlight here is how easy this is to do. This is something that anyone in their home can do. Maybe your family members who have no expertise in science. I know, at least for me, I'm one of the only people in my family who does science, but I have all sorts of people asking me what's going on with these AI tools, and they can use them without much training. And similar things are true for large language models and text. You can see uses of ChatGPT for things in education, as has been mentioned a couple of times. People could use it to write an essay, something to that effect, but also very practical things in day-to-day life. Could you help me make a balanced meal plan for my large family? And it can give you some response. This could also be important in Catholic contexts. There's a tool called Magisterium AI, which is a sort of Catholic GPT that's similar to ChatGPT, except that it's fine-tuned, I believe, on magisterial documents of the Catholic Church. And when you ask it a question, it will respond and it will cite its sources. Just another interesting example of something that anyone can now use. You just go to the website, type it in. You don't need to be a computer science expert to use it. Along with all of these practical applications and ease of use, there's been questions about AGI and existential risk, and a couple of the speakers have addressed this. I wanted to bring up this letter that was published earlier last year, where many of the leading AI experts in the field, certainly not all of them, it's been discussed that there's diversity of opinion among the experts in the field, but many of them, 33,000, decided to sign this petition calling for all of the AI experiments for these giant models like ChatGPT to cease in development and research for at least 6 months, to kind of give us time as a society to catch up, to maybe add additional regulations, to think more about the ethical implications, and so on. But what I want to call attention to here is not really the question of whether AGI is possible or not, whether or not there's an existential risk. I'll remain agnostic on that. But I want to call to mind this particular statement from the letter. It says, "This does not mean a pause on AI development in general, merely a stepping back from the dangerous race to ever larger, unpredictable black box models with emergent capabilities." So I think this is highlighting the fact that not all AI research is the same. There are AI researchers who are dealing with problems in these large language models and things that people have a sense that maybe this could be AGI, maybe it is already, maybe it could be someday. But there are also many very practical applications that we need not ask about existential risk. And we can pursue these applications without having to put a pause on them at this time. So these practical applications take on many different forms in all aspects of society, in business, customer service, marketing, human resources, anything you can think of. There's probably some way that AI is already impacting it, or it could be impacting it in the very near future. Something that sometimes gets missed in this discussion is its impact in science and medicine. There's a report put out by an organization at Stanford every year called the AI Index, where it talks about the state of the field, some of the recent developments and implications of that. And I wanted to highlight that in this year's report, for the very first time, there was a chapter specifically on AI applications in science and medicine. And I think this is important because it highlights the fact that many developments have happened in recent years in AI and its applications to science. And I think it's important for us to all be aware of. So that was the purpose of me giving this talk. There's many other resources out there for learning about this. So I have a short time and I'll address a few examples. If you're interested in learning more, I think these are a couple of good sources. There's a review article in Nature called Scientific Discovery in the Age of AI, as well as a shorter article on the National Academy's website. And one thing I want to highlight here is just if you look at the author list of this first piece, the Scientific Discovery in the Age of AI. You might not know any of these authors, but if you go and click on their names, you look at their affiliations, their departments, what's striking is that they come from so many different fields, from every different part of science, from physics, biology, chemistry, and much more. And they came together to write this article. And I think this is highlighting the fact that this one set of tools, AI, is having an impact in many different fields. And that's another reason why I thought it was particularly relevant to talk about at this conference. I've been coming here for, I think, 4 years now, and one of the things that I love most is that it's bringing so many different fields of science together. I get to talk to and learn from people in fields very different from mine that I would never talk to at a discipline-specific conference. So I thought it was very relevant for this audience. The first example that I'll talk about with AI helping solve a problem in science is called AlphaFold. This is released by the DeepMind company, which is the same as who made the AlphaGo program that I talked about on the first slide. It's kind of an interesting combination, a company working on game things as well as scientific studies. But if you're not familiar, the protein folding problem is in biology. You have DNA that encodes for proteins. A protein is essentially a biopolymer. It's a sequence of amino acids. But knowing the amino acid sequence is not sufficient to know what the protein is going to do, because what the protein does is very dependent on its structure, its 3D conformation, and it's a very non-trivial problem to go from that amino acid sequence to the structure. So this has been a very long-standing challenge in biology of how do we go from the sequence to the function. And AlphaFold was able to solve this for the first time a few years ago. So the way this is done, or the way that people considered it solved, was there's a competition out there similar to what some of the previous speakers talked about with this image classifications. There were these competitions where everyone would use the same data set, and different teams would compete to try to get better results on that data set. So there were certain proteins that had had their structures recently discovered but had not been released to the public yet. So different teams could train on all the structures that were known and publicly available, but then they would all be evaluated on these held out compounds that no one could have access to. And so each year people would try this. Eventually AlphaFold, DeepMind's team, was able to achieve the first place in this competition, but still wasn't good enough for people to consider it for use in predicting for experimental results. But a couple years later, they did achieve good enough accuracy that many people in the field do consider this problem to be solved. And I think that's evidenced by the fact that this article by AlphaFold is now, even though it's a few years old, is now one of the most cited papers of all time in science. It's one of the top 500 cited papers already, just after a few years. And in talking to some people who work in this field, who work in pharmaceuticals and structural biology, my understanding is people are actively using this to help inform what experiments they do and so on. Another example is in using AI to design new drug candidates. So similar to the kind of generative modeling where you can prompt a model and say, I want a picture that looks like X. I want a picture that looks like a dog, looks like a cat, whatever. Instead, you can say, I want a molecule that fits into this protein pocket. You could maybe even say, I know these parts of the molecule will interact with the protein pocket well. I want you to generate a bridge that will connect them well and keep them positioned in the correct way. And this is working not on images, but on the actual 3D coordinates of the atoms in the molecule. So this has been also very successful. In some cases, I believe drugs generated using similar approaches are already undergoing clinical trials, or at least will be soon. Another case a little bit closer to my own expertise in chemistry and material science was another team, also part of DeepMind, interestingly enough, was working on material science and the problem of discovering new solid electrolytes. And this paper was published at the end of last year, and it was widely reported, even in the secular media. This is just a press release from the company, but there were many public media articles saying that there were millions of new materials discovered by DeepMind. And if you're a material scientist or chemist, you know that a million is an enormous number when it comes to chemistry and material science. There are not a lot of materials that are easy to synthesize and develop, so this seems like a very bold claim. And I bring up this example to highlight the fact that while AI has done a lot of great things for science, it is sometimes overhyped. And in this specific example, there were other researchers who analyzed the conclusions of the article from DeepMind, and they found, I have in bold here, unfortunately finding scant evidence for compounds that fulfill the trifecta of novelty, credibility, and utility. And they also highlight that there's a great need to highlight or to incorporate domain expertise. So it seems that the work at DeepMind, while it was still impactful, it did still advance the field. It perhaps did not incorporate sufficient domain expertise to give credence to its claims. There's also been many other fields of science impacted by AI, and I'll just briefly highlight a few others. One is in mathematics. AI has helped to guide humans in improving or discovering new theorems and conjectures. It's been able to solve Olympiad-level geometry problems. It's also been able to learn how to predict global weather forecasting in the medium range, which, as many of you know or can imagine, this is very computationally demanding and difficult to do using traditional methods. It's also made advances in nuclear and quantum physics, for example, in creating a new algorithm that uses reinforcement learning to help confine the plasma in a tokamak for a nuclear fusion reactor. It's also pushed the frontiers of something called density functional theory, which is very important in quantum chemistry for simulating molecules and solving a long-standing problem in that field. I'll make a brief mention of a small contribution that I've made to this field in chemistry. We were able to combine AI with some very talented roboticists, experimentalists who created a high-throughput experimentation setup that was able to integrate some relatively simple AI methods, but by combining these two, we could discover new compounds much more quickly than would be able to do otherwise. And I think this is a good example of another use case of AI in science is in self-driving labs. I think there's a lot of promise here, and especially in chemistry and materials science, for self-driving labs to remove some of the autonomy from, or the monotony from some scientific experiments and help us advance science more quickly. Now, given all of these examples, I'd like to take a bit of a step back and think about what does this mean for how we do science? It seems that this is actually enabling a new paradigm shift in science. And I think this was covered nicely by a blog post by Microsoft Research, where they argue that There's been several paradigms in science throughout human history, and this is really enabling the next step in that process. So the paradigms that they argue have existed in the past, first is empirical and direct observation. This is what existed for for most of human history, for thousands of years. We've always been observing the world, we've always been trying new things, but it wasn't until the last maybe several centuries where we started to write down our observations in terms of equations and physical models, use inductive reasoning to go from these specific experiments to more general principles. And this created the second paradigm of science. A third paradigm came only in the last 100 years or so, where for some of these equations, we realized that they're not exactly soluble. For example, some differential equations that might not have an analytical solution, but we can still learn something by simulating them numerically, by taking some finite time steps and simulating them step by step. And in recent years, in the last maybe couple of decades, we've gained the infrastructure and the amount of data to be able to do discovery using very large data sets of tens of thousands or millions of whether it be chemical compounds or in other areas of science, that we're able to do more with large data sets than we could with smaller data sets. Then this fifth paradigm, based on AI, I think builds on the third and fourth paradigms, that we're able to emulate these simulations because even with quick simulations, with good computers, it's still very difficult to access the timescales necessary to understand some processes, for example, in biology. However, if we can use AI to learn from previous simulations that we've run, we can speed that process up and do discovery more quickly. And one thing I want to be sure to mention here is that I don't think these paradigms are mutually exclusive in any way. I think they all build on one another, they all coexist, and they all complement one another. So this isn't to argue that AI is ever going to replace any of the previous parts of science, but rather that it's going to build on it and complement it. AI can aid in every stage of the scientific method. We learn in grade school this kind of cartoonish representation of the scientific method, that it's the step-by-step process where you have a question, you do some research, have a hypothesis, so on and so forth. And as practicing scientists, I think we know that it's more complicated than that. There's loops in the process, there's many points of failure. But all that to say that given this process, AI can help in every step of the way. So it can help with formulating a question for brainstorming which questions are important to answer given maybe some literature precedent. It can help with searching the literature and summarizing papers. It can help with doing the actual experiments themselves. For example, predicting which experiments are more likely to succeed, so that you can only do those rather than doing a purely trial and error approach. And it can also help with presenting the findings of the work and creating presentations and in writing papers. However, there are definitely some potential shortcomings here. So we as scientists, yeah, so many of you may have seen this or recognize what this means. So there was a paper published in a peer-reviewed journal earlier this year, and the first sentence of that paper began, "Certainly, here is a possible introduction for your topic." And as anyone who has used ChatGPT knows, that is a hallmark of the beginning of ChatGPT responses. So this was a failure in many regards. First of all, that the authors thought it was okay to use ChatGPT to do their writing for them and not proofread it enough, but also on the part of the peer reviewers and the editors that this was able to be published. Fortunately, it was ultimately retracted. They found that there were some other potential scientific misconduct things in the paper as well. But I bring this up, I mean, it's kind of funny, but it's also kind of not, because right now I think we live in a time in society where there's potentially degrading trust in science, and things like this only contribute to that degradation. So it's very important for us as scientists to take all of our duties seriously. And that also carries over to the peer review process. There was a study earlier this year that looked at all of the submissions and reviews for some of the popular AI conferences. And Alex showed a graph showing a similar thing in his presentation, that many people seem to be using AI to write different parts of their papers, but this is also true of reviews. And this study found that maybe up to 1 in 6 of the reviews for AI conferences were potentially substantially modified by LLMs. So more than just doing a spell check or writing updates. So I think this is, for these people who did this, this seems to be lacking in their responsibility as scientists to do peer review properly. I think we also have to be mindful of the potential ethics and misuse of AI and the tools that we develop. This is a example somewhat close to home in chemistry, where it was widely reported a couple of years ago that there was an AI tool that generated tens of thousands of possible new chemical weapons in a short time. I think this particular example was overhyped a little bit, that the types of things that it was generating were actually extremely similar to things that we already know are chemical weapons. These are things that are publicly known, the structures of it. So it's not doing anything that couldn't have been done prior to AI per se. However, I think this is still an example that reminds us that we do need to be careful about these potential dual use concerns. And whenever people talk about dual use, the question often comes up, should we be releasing the code and the models for our paper? And I want to argue that the answer should almost always be yes, especially if we're publishing in a scientific context. There have been a few examples in recent years of companies publishing in scientific journals and then not releasing their code and models, which is understandable from the company perspective that they want to protect their competitive advantage. However, that prevents the community from replicating their work and for validating it. So my perspective is that as scientists, our work should always be reproducible by the community such that it can be better built upon. So I think this is important for science going forward, that we all try to release our code and models to as much as we can. I'll just close with some more philosophical thoughts. I'm definitely not a philosopher, but I do spend a lot of time thinking about AI and its impact on science. So I want to argue that a human contribution to science is necessary. What do I mean by that? I'll start by saying what I don't mean. I don't mean that there are necessarily parts of science that it's impossible for a computer to do. I think that's a sort of God of the gaps argument, or in this case, a human of the gaps argument, that there's things that a computer could never do. Maybe that's true, but I don't really want to make that claim here. What I want to say instead is that I think science is very important to us as humans and what it means to be human, and that it's important for us to be participating in that process of science rather than giving over that responsibility to an AI. I think that's for a couple of reasons, one being that in order to decide what questions we work on, what things are most important to us as individuals and society, that's something that we need to be doing ourselves to guide AI in the right direction. And also just I think it's part of the human condition, who we are as humans, to wonder, to want to do science, to want to learn. And I think getting that from a machine rather than doing the work ourselves is definitely not going to be as satisfying. Now I'll just close with a few thoughts on AI, work, and human dignity. Our church has said a lot about the role of work and what it means to us as humans and our dignity. And I think some of these same principles also apply to scientific work rather than just work in general, and are even more important now that we're discussing so many of the applications of AI. One quote comes from the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church. It says that work is a fundamental right and a good for mankind, a useful good worthy of man because it is an appropriate way for him to give expression to and enhance his human dignity. So I think this is definitely true of scientific work, at least in my experience, that being able to understand the world or try to understand God's creation has certainly been a way for me to express and enhance my human dignity. And I don't think that's something that I should try to give away to an AI tool. And secondly, a quote from Pope St. John Paul II. He said that man must work both because the Creator has commanded it and because of his own humanity, which requires work in order to be maintained and developed. And I think scientific work has helped me for sure to maintain, to develop my humanity. I think working in science has been a school of humility. I'm always surrounded by very intelligent people who know a lot more than I do about various fields. And it's also been a way of cultivating the wonder and awe at creation. And I think that's something that we should not be trying to replace. So I'll just conclude with a few key takeaways. The first being that even without more advancements, even if we never achieve an AGI, if we put a pause on everything, there's still an enormous potential for the practical uses of AI in the world today. And specifically for us as scientists, it's of interest that AI has done a lot to enable advances in very diverse fields of science. I mentioned a few here, but there are probably many of you in the room who know something about your field that AI has made impacts there as well. So if you're not already learning about these tools, I encourage you to start doing so. And then finally, I just want to emphasize that we as scientists need to use AI responsibly in all of its different forms, and that we as Catholic scientists, I think, should be leaders in this discussion of how to use AI ethically, because we have this strong ethical framework that comes from our faith. So I think we need to be leaders in that discussion. So with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.